I can remember it as if it were yesterday, even though it was 8 long years ago. We were just 4th graders, innocent kids with wild imaginations who found a strange joy in telling horror stories after school. But as with many things that bring joy to children, it didn't last. Our parents started complaining, saying one of the other kids had gone home scared. Looking back, I can't help but laugh at how we managed to terrify each other with our childish tales. But there was one story that stood out, one that made a girl cry, and it went something like this. The girl in the story was in college, fresh out of the nest, out on her own for the very first time. She had always been close to her parents, and leaving home had been tough. She kissed her little sister and her loyal dog goodbye out of guilt, and her little brother out of obligation. The university she attended was located across the state, up north, where the fields seemed to stretch on forever. It felt like a different world altogether, a world far removed from her small hometown. She lived in a high-rise, not on the highest floor, but close enough, just 3 or 4 floors down from the rooftop. It was a peculiar place. This university, privately funded by some eccentric billionaire, hence its peculiar name. Eccentric Billionaire University. Most of the students, like her, resided in this single towering building. Floors upon floors stacked atop one another, and a fairly large plaza on the ground level. On sunny days, the air was filled with the sounds of chatter, and the elevator's bells rang incessantly. She had a roommate, a nice enough person, and the two of them got along well. Their room, although small, had a cozy feel to it, with a couple of potted plants, a wardrobe, and a dresser. The girl took the bed closer to the door, but that was only because her roommate had moved in first. She preferred to sleep away from the door, but she didn't complain. She'd always been a considerate person. Besides, she had a thing about doors. They made her uneasy. In her childhood, she had been convinced that things could sneak in through doors. The wind would rustle the curtains and make the wooden floorboards creak, resembling ominous footsteps. Classes began in the fall, and she was serious about her education. She avoided parties and the allure of young men, perhaps out of fear or maybe due to her lack of experience in such matters. But whatever the reason, she dedicated herself to her studies. She heard the whispers of her fellow students, calling her odd and strange, but she had developed a thick skin from years of being different. Her professors adored her. She was always the first to be called upon, whether her hand was raised or not. Then came the beginning of October, and she had an important exam looming just a few days away. It would determine a significant portion of her grade, so she was understandably anxious about it. She was accustomed to her study routine by now, and that evening was no different. She found herself in the library, as she often did, surrounded by textbooks and papers. But that night, something felt off. Usually, she left the library with a sense of accomplishment. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed more preparation. As she studied, a young man nearby caught her eye. She had seen him around campus, but had never spoken to him. He was engrossed in a book and seemed oblivious to the small portable radio on his table. The radio emitted a static-filled newscast about some incident in the next county over. She paid little attention to it, focusing on her studies instead. Eventually, she mustered the courage to ask the young man to turn off the radio, explaining that she needed to concentrate. He complied, and she continued her work. Hours passed, and it was now well past 2 in the morning. She felt the need for a break, some fresh air, and remembered that she had left one of her books in her dorm room. She was determined to cover every topic for her exam, and she had concentrated too much on one particular reading. She gathered her belongings and made her way out of the library. She bid the young man farewell, even though a small voice in her head suggested that maybe she shouldn't leave just yet. No, she thought. I need to get that book and study more. Everything will work out. As she walked back to the high-rise, she couldn't help but notice how late it was. She crossed paths with a jogger and their dog, and the lateness struck her as odd. Who goes jogging at this hour? But her mind quickly returned to thoughts of her own dog, whom she missed dearly. He was probably cuddled up with her little sister by now, and she felt a pang of guilt at leaving him behind. Nevertheless, she reached the high-rise and pushed open the heavy door. The air outside was brisk, even colder than usual for October. She pressed the button for the elevator, and it arrived swiftly, its doors opening with a loud chime. She watched as the elevator descended down its glass tube, the sensation of being transported down, intensifying the further it went. Finally, it settled, and she stepped inside, the doors closing around her like a pair of jaws. The elevator whisked her upward, and she began to feel nauseated. She took deep breaths, trying to calm herself, and checked her watch. It was now 2:20. Surely her roommate would be fast asleep. She was determined to make it a quick trip. The elevator reached her floor, and she stepped out, feeling unsteady. She approached her dorm room door, key in hand, and mentally visualized the layout inside. She didn't want to fumble around in the dark, and she certainly didn't want to wake her roommate. She knew the girl was a heavy sleeper, but she didn't want to risk it. The girl tried to be as quiet as possible, a skill she had mastered over the years to avoid waking people up. She had a deep fear of disturbing someone's sleep. In the dim light of the hallway, she reached her dresser, found the book she needed, and turned to leave. She carefully closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway, taking a moment to catch her breath. It was all so routine. She checked her watch again. 2:23. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in the library, her face imprinted on the thick textbook in front of her. Her neck ached from the awkward position she had slept in, and she couldn't recall falling asleep at all. She was embarrassed, realizing that she must have slept for quite some time. She looked around, hoping to spot the young man, but he was nowhere to be found. She hastily packed her books, slinging her bag over her shoulder, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the library. Outside, the high-rise was surrounded by cop cars, emergency vehicles, and news reporters. A small crowd of students had gathered, all trying to piece together what had happened. She passed a young newswoman, not much older than herself, with blonde hair and a low-cut top that revealed just enough to capture viewers' attention. Her voice was grave, and the girl struggled to make sense of her words over the growing noise. She pushed her way through the crowd, finally making her way into the high-rise. Inside, policemen were scattered about, some talking to students or faculty, others in hushed conversation with each other. The atmosphere was heavy with concern and distress. No one paid any attention to her as she rode the elevator up, nor did they notice when she exited on her floor. It was eerily quiet here, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene below. Most of the dorm room doors were left open. Water from freshly taken showers tracked footprints on the carpet, and shaving cream spilled over sinks. Clothes lay strewn across beds, waiting to be worn. She turned the corner, and there it was. Her own dorm room, with 2 strips of yellow police tape forming a thick X over the doorframe. The sheriff and a deputy stood by the door, their expressions grave. The girl felt a surreal detachment as she approached her door. The deputy placed his arm against her chest, telling her she couldn't enter. She tried to wriggle away, her determination overriding her fear. She ducked under the deputy's arm and tore through the police tape, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed the door open and screamed. Her roommate lay on the far bed, a gruesome sight. Her body was mutilated, her organs grotesquely sprawled across the sheets. The stench of blood and death hung heavy in the air. Her eyes, what remained of them, stared lifelessly. Her throat slit. Her body was a canvas of brutality, with one of her breasts cut open, adipose tissue spilling out into the cavity that was once her stomach. Her thighs were covered in dark bruises, her genitalia brutally mutilated. Strands of her hair had been ripped from her scalp, littering the bed. The girl's stomach churned and she vomited on the floor, unable to tear her eyes away from the horrifying scene. But what chilled her to the bone, what made her feel like she too was being stalked, was the message scrawled on the wall in blood. It's to, aren't you glad you didn't turn on the lights?